Good morning. This is me when I wonder if there's a smudge on my lens. Here I come. Better? Yeah. Okay. Where are we? Matthew 23. I did played my Jeremiah 29:11 to 13 song on the McShane group on Facebook. It's Jeremiah 29 is one of our chapters for their McShane reading today. Such a beautiful chapter. All right, verse 16. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind! For what is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. So, what he's talking about now is kind of like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a way to equate it to our day. But the literal thing that was going on was, well, I swear by the temple. Well, then, if he broke that promise, what restitution had to be made? And people were like, well, I mean, he can't give the temple to anyone, so whatever, I guess let it go. But if the guy said, I swear by the gold of the temple, and he didn't come through, well, they wanted gold. Same thing, I swear by, a dozen lambs on the altar. Well, then they want their dozen lambs. But if he swore by the altar, well, I mean, what can you do? But that's the thing Jesus is saying is like, well, if you swear by the temple, you swear by the altar, those are the greater things. And there you can't just have these loopholes where I swear by and then you get out of it. And I mean, Jesus, his real teaching on this, he's really rebuking them for the loopholes and the ways that they think they can get out of stuff. His teaching was let your yes be yes and let your no be no, and anything more than this is from the evil one. That is what he says earlier in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. And so, in short, there are no loopholes to sin. There's no like, well, this and that, and like as soon as we have to start like reasoning why our sinful behavior isn't sinful, we're just compounding our problems. I don't know. I think about like, well, I didn't tell a lie. I just didn't mention that. And it's like, well, no, right there, you're guilty. Done deal. You're guilty of sin. And so, yeah, I don't have, there's not at least I'm not coming up with a direct, equivalent to what we might see commonly in our day. But in general, the principle of just people trying to cover up their sins with, justifications and reasoning and logic, well, that doesn't work with God. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat, and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of exhortation and self-indulgent. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside may be clean also. So, here are three examples speaking of the same problem, yet there's also some mini teachings in the middle of this all. The main issue we have here is the fact that the Pharisees were very good at doing outward acts that be seen by men, the ones that everyone can see and tell. They're good at doing those, but it's the stuff in private. It's what's going on the inside that other people can't see, and yet they were having a horrific time. I mean, working backwards. He talks about them cleaning the outside of the cup and the dish. Now, I'm assuming Pharisees clean the insides and outsides of their cups. But what he's using as a picture is that it's like if you take a cup and you wash the outside. I mean, here we go. Look at this. There's a little bit of a right there. See that? Watch. Beautiful. And now this cup is ready for you to drink out of it. Except for all the coffee in the bottom on the inside. That's when you kill the end of the pot and you get a little bit of coffee there, safe. So the point is pretty white cup on the outside. Got that looking sparkly and clean, but it's not clean on the inside. And that's what he's saying with them with the cup. He's saying, hey, you guys are washing the outsides. It's like you're not washing the inside of the stuff you eat. And we all know what the important part of the cup is going to be. It's the part where the food goes. Backing it up, they strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So the idea was that first off, a gnat was an unclean thing. It was not a clean animal. And so, I mean, just in short, it wasn't a clean animal. I've heard people talk about how you have to drain the blood and things like that. But I mean, regardless of draining blood, the gnat's unclean either way. And so if they swallowed we've all swallowed a fly or something, like it's in our throat. Well, they would induce vomiting because they cannot eat an unclean thing. But then Jesus says, well, while you're publicly to show everyone, they saw you swallow that fly, and so you force yourself to throw up in public so that people know you're not going to swallow that fly. But at home, you're eating an entire camel, which is a very large, unclean animal, also unclean to them. So what's up with the public show if at home you're swallowing a camel? And then lastly, we have this idea of publicly, they're paying the tithe on their herbs in their herb garden. So it's literally like, it's one thing when you get 10 apples and you're like, and this one apple is for the Lord. But it's another thing when you get to the point where you're there with your mint and your basil and your thyme and your parsley and you're snipping off, and there's a leaf for the Lord, 9 leaves for me, a leaf for the Lord, 9 leaves for me. And so they're doing this. They're going to great lengths. And this is kind of the emphasis here. It's not about the outward show as much on this one, but it's the great lengths to give God the portion that is owed him, and yet putting no effort into the weightier matters: justice, mercy, faith. Because you can't really measure justice, mercy, and faith like you can basil. Basil I can count. 1 leaf, 9 leaves, call it good. I'm good with God now. But justice, well, I mean, how do you even measure that? So, I mean, you just kind of let that one go on by the side. And I think that's the problem we see, is that sometimes the most important things God wants from us are not the measurable ones. People like measurable things because people like law. They might not like obeying the government, but they like law, the principle. They like to know that they're in good standing with God. And if God gives you 10 rules and I keep my 10 rules, well, then I know I'm good with God. And if he gives you 613 rules and you keep your 613 rules, then I know I'm good with God. And, we as Christians, we don't get that kind of satisfaction. We get to know we're right with God because of Jesus. And even as I mentioned last Sunday morning at our church, that can be offensive and hard to swallow for people because they want to be right with God. They want to be good enough for God. They want to have accomplished enough so that they can rest assured that they're okay because they know they've done what they need to do. And that's not what we're called to do. We're called to believe. And it is an offense to our flesh and to our selfish self to, I need to be working at being good. I need to be working hard for God. And it's hard for people to swallow this concept that it's not about you working harder or being better. You're not going to be good enough for God. And that's okay because God never asked you to. Now we draw near to him in holiness. We grow closer to God. But so that's why this idea is that the scribes and the Pharisees, they put a lot of effort into measurable tasks. If I'm supposed to pray, I'm going to pray on the street corner where everyone can see me and everyone will know how spiritual I am. And if I need a tithe, I'm going to tithe on everything. And I'm going to tithe on my mint, my cumin, because I can count it, I can give it, and then call it done. But when it comes to justice, mercy, and faith, well, how does one really measure that? Hi, guys. We're just jumping on right now. And so that's the problem, was that these Pharisees, they didn't give attention to the weightier things, the more important things, because they weren't just easy to just measure and call it good and call it a day. Now, it is worth mentioning, though it isn't the main point of this passage, that verse 23 does conclude with, these you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone. For what it's worth, Jesus didn't actually have a problem with them tithing on the mint, cumin, and all that. These men wanted to give God 10%, and they wanted to give it of everything. And Jesus said, good. Some of these works you're doing, they're not bad. And that's maybe worth noting, right? I've been hitting that jam the last couple of days of just, not being good enough for God, never being good enough for God, but God not requiring you to be good enough for him. Salvation through grace alone, by faith alone. But these you ought to have done. God's not saying don't do good works, right? That would be contrary to the Bible as well. God's not saying don't tithe or don't give or don't this or don't that. He's just saying, do all these good works. Do the things you feel God wants you to do, but just make sure you don't leave out the weightier things. The love, justice, mercy, kindness, right? You can't just measure those and call it good. Religious people like boxes to check. Showed up to church, gave my tithe, I brought cookies for potluck or whatever, And so here he's just saying, no, those are all good things. Don't stop. But don't leave the weightier things undone. Justice, mercy, and faith. And so this whole section 23 to 26, it's all about outward shows versus the inward heart. Checking boxes versus truly living and serving the Lord. And so there you go. All right. God bless you guys. I will see you guys tomorrow. Maybe got a couple days left to knock out the rest of this chapter of woes, Matthew 23. I will see you guys around.